And good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are around the world. I am Marcus Holmes from the Love and Stuff community, and it's my pleasure to come from the Love and Stuff page, as well as the Marcus R. Holmes page on Facebook, LinkedIn Live, Twitch TV, and YouTube events to share with you another Black History Month moment. For this entire month, we have been taking a moment every day at 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time to share with you some of the excellence, brilliance, sacrifices, and harrowing stories of African Americans and those persons of African descent who have made unique and important contributions to our country and our world. And we will continue daily through Sunday, where we will culminate in a celebration at 6 o'clock p.m. across all spectrums of African American life. And so I hope that you will click, share, and tag someone to join in today's Black History Moment. All week long, we will be talking about architecture and the arts. So we'll not only talk about architects as we did yesterday and architecture as buildings, but we will also talk about the arts, genres, and different artists as well in this week. So you don't want to miss a single night, and you might want to set yourself a reminder to join us each night. I wanted to start by asking you, are any of these names familiar to you? And they may all be, but give me some likes or some loves or some emoji that expresses your sentiment when you hear these names. Miles Davis, Duke Ellington, Willie Armstrong, John Coltrane, Louis Armstrong, Charles Parker, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Count Basie, Lester Young, Herbie Hancock, Coleman Hawkins, Charles Mingus, Art Blakely, Ornette Coleman, Max Roach, Mary Lou Williams, Nat King Cole, Charles Lloyd. All of those names may be familiar to you, or some of them may be, all associated with an art form that is uniquely originated from African Americans. One of two that are uniquely originated, though there are many others. But as we look back over our history, jazz. Jazz is a music genre that originated in the African American communities of New Orleans or Nolens, Louisiana, in the late 1900s and early 20th century. Late 19th century, rather, and early of 20th centuries, with its roots in blues and ragtime. Jazz is characterized by swing and blue notes, complex chords, call and response vocals, polyrhythms, and improvisation. Both jazz and blues originated in the South, in the southern part of the United States, around the late 1800s to early 1900s, with blues arriving first, then jazz just a little later. Both were inventions of African Americans who combine African music concepts with European music concepts, thus making these both uniquely American music genres. 100 years ago this month, February 26, 1917, or I'm sorry, over 100 years ago, I guess I'll say 105 years ago, 104 years ago, what is generally acknowledged as the first recording of jazz was released. Livery Stable Blues, performed by the original Dixieland Jazz JASS band. It was a best-selling record for Victor, but it is a problematic first, as it is a recording of a white band performing an African-American genre. There was a copyright lawsuit concerning authorship of the piece, but worse, far from crediting the New Orleans African-American musicians they learned from, these young musicians claim to have invented jazz. but it was published at an interesting moment in United States history as emerging African American genres of blues and jazz were bursting into American consciousness and spreading across the country and then across the world. Efforts to segregate music in the United States to market music by European Americans, artists to European Americans, and to market music by African American artists to African Americans. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you. Were defied by African American composers and performed in a variety of ways to get their music to a wide audience. Among many African Americans, there was a desire to move away from musical forms such as spirituals, which were identified with slavery days. And yet they also wanted music styles of their own. A new sound arose in street and community music of African Americans in the late 19th century. It was usually one singer accompanied by a guitar and characterized by bent or blue notes, not on the standard scale. These notes likely had earlier origins as they are found in rural African American work songs. Examples are found in field recordings of African American work songs made as the genre was disappearing. This is Calling Trains by an unknown former railroad worker in 1936 by John Lomax, and Cornfield Holler, sung by Abraham Powell, recorded in 1939. The blues notes could be best played on instruments that allowed the creation of blue notes, such as the guitar, especially slide guitar, wind, and bass instruments. The songs expressed a longing, loss, or desire and came to be called the blues. The word blues already existed in popular music, distributed for sad songs and love songs, so many song titles had blues in them long before blues music saw print. And so I wanted to make sure that part of the legacy was clear. And what we will share today is some of the information regarding the early days of blues and a little bit of some of the blues music. Of course, none of this music is ours, but under the Copyright Act of 1976, we have a permitted fair use to use it for the purposes of critique. And so we are doing that in this Black History Month moment. And I just wanted to make that claim. Jazz is a musical genre that originated in the African American communities, as we stated, of New Orleans, with its roots in blues and ragtime. And since the 1920s jazz age, it has been recognized as a major form of musical expression in traditional and popular music, linked by the common bonds of African American and European American musical parentage. Jazz is characterized by swing and blue notes, as mentioned, and has roots in West African culture and musical expressions, some of which West Indies, and in African American music traditions. As jazz spread around the world, it drew on national, regional, and local music cultures, which gave rise to different styles. New Orleans jazz began in the early 1900s, around 1910, combining earlier brass band marches, ragtime and blues with collective polyphonic improvisations. In the 1930s, heavily arranged dance-oriented swing bands, such as Kansas City Jazz, a hard swing and bluesy improvisational style, and gypsy jazz were the prominent styles. Bebop emerged in the 1940s, shifting jazz from danceable popular music toward a more challenging musician's music, which was played at faster tempos and used more chord-based improvisation. Cool jazz, developed near the end of the 1940s, introduced a calmer, smoother sound and longer, linear melodic lines. The mid-50s saw the emergence of hard bop, which introduced influences from rhythm and blues, gospel and blues, especially in the saxophone and piano playing. Modal jazz developed in the late 1950s, using the mode or music scale as the basis of musical structure and improvisation, as did free jazz, which explored playing without regular meter, beat, and formal structure. Jazz rock fusion appeared in the late 60s and early 70s, combining jazz improvisation with rock music's rhythms, electric instruments, and highly amplified stage sound. In the early 80s, a commercial form of jazz fusion called smooth jazz became successful, garnering significant radio airplay. Other styles and genres abound in the 2000s, such as Afro-Cuban and Latin jazz. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the etymology and definition, though scholars will not all agree on etymology. The origin of the word jazz has resulted in considerable research, and its history is well documented. It is believed to be related to jasm, a slang term back to 1860, which means pep or energy. The earliest written record of the word is in a 1912 article in the Los Angeles Times, in which a minor league baseball pitcher described a pitch which he called a jazz ball because it wobbles and you simply can't do anything with it. The use of the word in a musical context was documented as early as 1915 in the Chicago Daily Tribune. Its first documented use in a musical context in New Orleans was in a November 14, 1916 Times article about jazz bands. In an interview with National Public Radio, musician U.B. Blake offered his recollections of the slang connotation of the term, saying, quote, "When Broadway picked it up, they called it J-A-Z-Z. It wasn't called that. It was spelled J-A-S-S. That was dirty. And if you knew what it was, you wouldn't say it in front of ladies," unquote. Jazz is difficult to define because it encompasses such a wide range of music spanning a period of over 105 years, probably longer, from ragtime to the rock-infused fusions. Attempts have been made to define jazz from the perspective of other musical traditions, such as European musical history or African music. There are critics that argue that its terms of reference and its definitions must be broader. Defining jazz as a form of art music which originated in the United States through the confrontation of the Negro with European music. It argues that it differs from European music in that jazz has a special relationship to time defined as swing. Jazz involves the spontaneity and vitality of musical production in which improvisation plays a role and contains a sonority and manner of phrasing which mirrors the individuality of the performing jazz musician. Most of us would say that inventing meaning while letting loose in the essence and promise of jazz, in the opinion of Robert Christgau. A broader definition that encompasses different eras of jazz has been proposed by Travis Jackson. It is music that includes qualities such as swing, improvising, group interaction, developing an individual voice, and being open to different musical possibilities. Corinne Gibbert argued that jazz is a construct which designates a number of musics with enough in common to be understood as part of a coherent tradition. In contrast to commentators who have argued for excluding types of jazz, musicians are sometimes reluctant to define the music they play. Duke Ellington, one of jazz's most famous figures, says, "It's all music," quote, end quote. And I will talk a little bit about improvisation, but I want to tell you that there are so many forms of jazz that have emanated from jazz, some of which have been mentioned, and I will just share a few of those as we move forward. As it relates to improvisation, although jazz is considered difficult to define, as we have already characterized, in part because it contains many subgenres, which we will talk a little bit about, improvisation is one of its defining elements. The centrality of improvisation is attributed to the influence of earlier forms of music such as blues, a form of folk music which arose in part from the work songs and field hollers of African American slaves on plantations. These work songs were commonly structured around a repetitive call and response pattern, but early blues was also improvisational. Classical music performance is evaluated more by its fidelity to the musical score, with less attention given to interpretation, ornamentation, and accompaniment. The classical performer's goal is to play the composition as it is written. In contrast, jazz is often characterized by the product of interaction and collaboration, placing less value on the contribution of the composer, if there is one, and more on the performer. The jazz performer interprets a tune in individual ways, never playing the same composition twice. Depending on the performer's mood, experience, and interaction with band members or audience members, the performer may change melodies, harmonies, and time signatures. One of the things that I absolutely love about it, and things that I think I try and have tried to adopt in some of the music that I've been blessed to do. In early Dixieland, aka New Orleans jazz, performers took turns playing melodies and improvising, counter melodies. In the swing area of the 1920s to 40s, big bands relied more on arrangements which were written or learned by ear and memorized. Soloists improvised within these arrangements. In the bebop area of the 1940s, big bands gave way to small groups and minimal arrangements in which the melody was stated briefly at the beginning and most of the piece was improvised. Modal jazz abandoned chord progressions to allow musicians to improvise even more. In many forms of jazz, a soloist is supported by a rhythm section of one or more chordal instruments, piano or guitar, for example, double bass, and drums. The rhythm section plays chords and rhythms that outline the composition structure and complement the soloist. In avant-garde and free jazz, the separation of soloist and band is reduced, and there is license or even a requirement for the abandonment of the chords, scales, and meters. Since the emergence of bebop, forms of jazz that are commercially oriented or influenced by popular music have been criticized. According to Bruce Johnson, there has always been a tension between jazz as a commercial music and an art form. Traditional jazz enthusiasts have dismissed bebop, free jazz, and jazz fusions as form of debasement and betrayal. An alternative view is that jazz can absorb and transform diverse musical styles. By avoiding the creation of norms, jazz allows avant-garde styles to emerge. We talked a little bit about jazz and race, and as you know, there are a number of musicians, great musicians, many of them, all of them in their own right, that have been influenced by this African-American style. And it is a tribute to African-American contributions. For others, jazz is a reminder of an oppressive and racist society that has its restriction on artist visions. And so I wanted to make mention of that. But having white bands play Black music did help to change some of the attitudes during that period toward race, especially for those who were willing to give the rightful due to the originator of the music and of their compositions. There are a number of women who play important and formidable roles. Some named earlier: Ella Fitzgerald, Billy Carter, Abby Lincoln, Dinah Washington, and Ethel Waters. There are many others that were musicians and songwriters, such as Valeda Snow, Irene Higginbotham, Dorothy Fields, who weren't always in front of the scenes, but part of rhythm sections and composers. And I want to talk, we talked a little bit about the early history of it, and it being an European classical music to some degree, influenced by African enslaved folk songs and the influence of West African culture. But it is uniquely and originated American music, blending African and European musical sensibilities. Okay. And then I want to talk just a little bit about the African rhythmic retention. The Black codes were outlawed drumming by slaves, which meant that African drumming traditions were not preserved in North America, unlike in Cuba, Haiti, and other places in the Caribbean especially. African-based rhythm patterns were retained in the United States in large part through body rhythms such as stomping, clapping, and patting, and juba dancing. In the post-Civil War period after 1865, African Americans were able to obtain surplus military bass drums, snare drums, and as an original American drum music emerged, there were related syncopated rhythmic figures. So some of the other styles of jazz, I will call them, that have emerged, of course, an Afro-Cuban influence, and some of that dates back to the 19th century when the habanera gained popularity. And some musicians from Havana and New Orleans would take the ferries back and forth between cities to perform. Ragtime, of course, had a very influential impact. The abolishment of slavery in 1865 led to new opportunities for the education of freed African Americans. Although strict segregation limited employment opportunities for most were able to find work in entertainment. Black musicians were able to provide entertainment in dances, minstrel shows, and in vaudeville during the time which many marching bands were formed. Black pianists played in bars, clubs, and brothels, such as ragtime developed. Ragtime appeared as sheet music popularized by African American musicians, such as the entertainer Ernest Hogan, whose hit songs appeared in 1895. 2 years later, Wes Osman recorded a medley of these songs as a banjo solo known as Ragtime Medley. And so white composers in 1897 began to just pick up that same music and ragtime pieces and publish Mississippi Rag and other publishings like that. Just a little note on the blues. Blues is the name given to both a musical form and a musical genre, and it originated in African American communities, primarily in the Deep South, around the end of the 19th century. From spirituals, work songs, as mentioned, field hollers, as mentioned, shouts and chants, and rhymed simple narrative ballads. The African use of pentatonic scales contributed to the development of blues notes and blues and jazz. Cornetist Buddy Bolden, sometimes called the father of jazz, played in New Orleans from 1895 to 1906. No recordings by him exist. His band is credited with creating the Big Four, the first syncopated bass drum pattern to deviate from the standard on the beat march. Afro-Creole pianist Jelly Roll Morton began his career in Storyville. Beginning in 1904, he toured with vaudeville shows to southern cities, Chicago and New York City. In 1905, he composed Jelly Roll Blues, which became the first jazz arrangement in print when it was published in 1915. It introduced more musicians to the New Orleans style. Going to just touch a little bit on swing. Morton loosened ragtime's rigid rhythmic feeling, decreasing its embellishments and employing a swing feeling. Swing is the most important and enduring African-based rhythmic technique used in jazz. An oft-quoted definition of swing by Louis Armstrong is, if you don't feel it, you'll never know it. The new Harvard Dictionary of Music states that swing is an intangible rhythmic momentum in jazz. Swing defies analysis. Claims to its presence may inspire arguments. The dictionary does nonetheless provide the useful description of triple subdivisions of the beat, contrasts with duple subdivisions. Swing superimposes 6 subdivisions of the beat over a basic pulse structure or 4 subdivisions. The aspect of swing is far more prevalent in African American music than in Afro-Caribbean music. One aspect of swing, which is heard in more rhythmically composed diaspora music, places strokes in between the triple and duple or double pulse grids. Didn't want to be too technical there or attempt to be at all. And so there are so many forms. And I do want to talk a little bit about Duke Ellington as a snapshot. It's something that we could not do in one day, but we will come back and do more and invite some jazz musicians to really talk about it. I think that will be a great love opportunity. We talked about bebop. We talked about African Cuban jazz, or kubop, as it is called. Hard bop and modal jazz, Dixie revival. We talked about free jazz, Latin jazz, sacred and liturgical jazz, which not a lot is written about. So I'd love to delve some more into that with some of our future guests. Relatively little has been written about sacred and liturgical jazz. There is a recent doctoral dissertation that examines the development of sacred jazz in the 1950s, but not a whole lot is written about that aspect. It is incorporated, though, from its inception, jazz, aspects of the African American sacred music, including spiritual and hymns. Secular jazz musicians often perform renditions of spirituals and hymns as part of their repertoire or isolated compositions such as Come Sunday or part of Black and Beige Suite by Duke Ellington. So many jazz artists have incorporated some part of the sacred and liturgical jazz. Jazz fusion. We hear a lot of Miles Davis when we hear that talk. Psychedelic jazz, jazz rock, jazz funk. We said smooth jazz earlier. Acid jazz, new jazz, jazz rap, punk jazz, and jazz core. M-bass, which started in 1980s when a loose collective of young African-American musicians in New York, which included Steve Coleman, Greg Osby, and Gary Thomas, developed a complex but grooving sound. Most M-bass participants tuned into more conventional music, but Coleman, the most active participant, continued developing his music in accordance with this M-bass concept. I'm pleased and proud to say among the many history accounts and reflections, there is no expiration date mentioned here for jazz. It is living on in this young country, and it is uniquely and originally an African American art form of which all African Americans should be proud. As I close, I just wanted to mention one of the greats among many of the names that I mentioned, Edward Kennedy Ellington, who was born April 29th, 1899 in Washington, D.C., passed away on May 24th, 1974, a band leader, musician, composer, considered one of the greatest participants in the jazz movement, and leader of a jazz orchestra spanning more than 6 decades, was a formidable personality and leader in the area of jazz music. He was noted for his inventive use of the orchestra or big band and for his eloquence and charisma. His reputation continued to rise after his death, and he was awarded a posthumous Pulitzer Prize Special Award for Music in 1999. Multi-Grammy winning, I think over 14 Grammys, twice as many Grammy nods or nominations. A leader to many, even some of the ones that were let go from his band wrote tributes to him. Charles Mingus among them, another great jazz musician. And so much about his work and times that you should read, from Cotton Club engagements, the 1930s and the 40s, and many of the people that came through his band and the Newport Jazz Festivals, and A Drum is a Woman. A lot of his work can be read upon. Too much to name in just our short moment, but I had to acknowledge him among the many. There are too many to be named that are great. I close with sharing a little bit, again, for the purposes of analysis, a little bit of the music one is in a sentimental mood, John Coltrane and Duke Ellington. We will play an excerpt of that, and then just two other excerpts we will do. Make sure we get it together here. Thank you for your patience. Yes, as I mentioned, he had 14 Grammy Awards from 1959 to 2000, and 3 of which were posthumous, and a total of 24 nominations. Total of 24. Sure I got this going right. Okay. All right. All right. A little bit of technology challenge here, always. Oh. Okay, well, we will just trying to make sure you had enough volume to be able to hear it. The very best of John Coltrane in a sentimental mood with Duke Ellington and John Coltrane. And so that we close our Black History Month moment. Tomorrow, join us again with Darren Williams, who will be talking again with us, and he will share on architecture. This week, all week, we're talking about architecture and the arts. We started yesterday talking about Black architects, excuse me, and some of their designs and work. And we will continue with architecture tomorrow. We're also talking about the arts this week. And jazz is one of the greatest and richest forms of art that was originated as an art form right here by African Americans in the United States. Though a number of Caucasian Americans and other European Americans have achieved great success and notoriety, please note that it is a uniquely African American art form. And so thank you for joining us. I hope you will click share to tag someone else to join us along this journey, and join us Sunday in our culmination on the 28th of a wonderful month of Black history. And we will have a great program at 6:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I just want to keep it before your mind in a very few short weeks. Our first book, The Gratefulness Journey Every Day, will be available on Amazon. We are excited, and you will hear more information about that. And tomorrow evening at 8:30 p.m., our weekly Love and Stuff show. You don't want to miss it, live on the Love and Stuff page. I'm Marcus Holmes. Thanks for joining us for this Black History Month moment.